Hello, everyone. This is the 231st episode of Soccer Nostalgia Talk Podcast. As always, this is Sean from Los Angeles and the Soccer Nostalgia blog. For this episode, I welcome back Dutch football fan Mr. Paul Dekkers as we discuss PSV Eindhoven during the decade of the 1990s. This will cover from the year 1992 to 2000. Welcome back, Paul.
Thank you, Sean. Good to be back.
So last time we left off at the end of the Bobby Robson era, the 2 years from 1990 to 1992. So as we come to the summer of 1992, and with the departure of Bobby Robson, what was the state of the affairs at PSV Eindhoven at this point?
Well, it was already in January 92, that was during the 91-92 season, in which PSV would eventually win the domestic league title for the second time in a row, that it was announced that Bobby Robson and the club would part ways with mutual respect. The main reason for that was a lack of success in Europe. And that's the reason, actually, the main reason why they didn't want to extend his contract. And Robson was quite disappointed about that. But he was considered to be nice, too nice for the group, and the squad needed more discipline. Yeah, Robson went to Sporting Lisbon. And during the season, there was also a conflict between star players like Romario and, well, let's say the water carriers. However, most of the players continued their spell at the club, though. In those days, we did not have the situation yet of 10 players coming in and going out. And the main goal for the club was to reach the Champions League group phase, in which Robson did not succeed. He lost against Anderlecht. We'll come back to that later. But there was not too much money to spend to strengthen the squad. And in order to get more money, it was an absolute requirement to be successful in the Champions League. So that's why they wanted to have another face for in front of the group.
Would it be fair to say that at this point, the afterglow of the 1988 Champions Cup had dissipated and there was perhaps expectations that they have to, it's a necessity to do well in Europe?
hmm Yes, absolutely. After the most glorious year of the club, 1988, PSV did not advance beyond the quarterfinals in European competition. And as mentioned, the years under Robson were not particularly successful in Europe. In his first season, he was eliminated in the first round of the European Cup Winners' Cup tournament by French side Montpellier. And the following year, like I said, painfully went wrong in the second round against Anderlecht. And this was not the standard that PSV had in mind after 1988. They also lost the World Club final against Nacional de Montevideo, which was very painful at the moment. But perhaps the standard that they set up in Europe was maybe a little bit too high for the available talent and the players that we had, that PSV had. And star player Romario demanded more ambition from the club. And actually, he was right about that. And the club did not really fulfill his wishes. So that's also why something had to change.
So, what was the backbone of the side remaining in a side, as you said, still dependent on the goals of the temperamental Brazilian star Romario?
Well, in the summer of 92, captain and club icon Erik Gerrits, he ended his career at the age of 38. Also, defender Stan Valks, he left the club to join Bobby Robson to Sporting. And after that, the backbone of the side remaining was mostly formed by some experienced players who were also part of the Dutch national squad that won the European Championship in 1988, like goalkeeper Hans van Breukelen, but he was 35 years old at the moment. Defender Adrie van Tichelen, who was also 35, and Barry van Aale, 29. And we had midfielders Gerald Vanenberg, who was only 28 by then, but he could have signed for Roma first, and he would leave the club 1 year later. And then we had Erwin Koeman, who was 31 years old, and striker Wim Kieft, who was 30 years old. So a lot of players from that Dutch national squad in 1988 were there, but they were not at the top level anymore. And in addition, Danish left back for many years, Jan Heinze, and Romanian defender George Popescu, who had joined PSV in 1990, were part of the backbone. Popescu would later join Tottenham Hotspur and also Barcelona. Now, finally, the promising young Dutch player Arthur Newman, He was 22 years old at the moment, and he would later have a great spell at Rangers in Scotland. He came from Twente, and an arbitration case was even necessary to secure his release because an agreement had already been reached between Twente and Manchester City. However, Newman himself, he preferred to go to Eindhoven. And at that moment, Man City was not the big club it is today. So that was the reason why. And he wanted to have his chances for the Dutch national team as well, of course.
Other familiar names, you have Yul Ellerman still, Edward Linskens, and the Zambian Kalusha
Well, yeah, yeah.
Bwalia, among others. Yeah. PSV surprised everyone by appointing a relative unknown, Hans Westerhoff, as the new manager. How was this decision regarded at a time when PSV will had a stature of the club that would appoint big names?
hmm Well, in the beginning, there was quite a bit of skepticism about his appointment. Westerhoff had done very well at FC Groningen, but that was like sub-top level. But they finished third in 1991 in a great season that they had. But Groningen is still a different level with different expectations. And he had this imagine of like a gentle, quiet school teacher. Maybe he was too nice too. So the question quickly came up as to whether he would be able to control Romario. And the board, they thought that Westerhoff would be able to do this because he had also managed to curb the whims of Yugoslavian star player Milko Jurovski at Groningen. But Romario was of a kind of a little different level, and it was already clear at the time that this would become a problem later on. And Westerhoff had not proven yet himself as a top coach, so Romario did not take him very seriously, and some things happens during the season that would cause their relationship to break. And things like these, they are fatal in a top team.
So let's take a look at this 1992-93 season. You already mentioned departures like Stan Valex to Sporting Club Portugal and Eric Gerrits, of course. But there's others like Tom Van Mol, the Belgian player, joined Sparta. Romario's friend Twan Schippers, he joined
hmm
MVV. Arno Dumernik also joined Sparta. Jerry de Jong, father of Nigel de Jong, would later
hmm
in the season join Groningen. The players who came on board included the likes of Mitchell van der Gag, a defender from Sparta, Danish striker Thomas Torninger from Vejle. You mentioned Arthur Newman from Twente. There's also Ernest Faber, also came from Sparta. Tom Cornelissen from Aalst. And finally, Dutch midfielder Raymond Bierens from RKC. Not a lot of big names in terms of transfer activity. Now, by their standards, PSV were disappointing in the league as they finished runners up to Feyenoord and were not a factor in the Champions League. Though they did qualify to the group stage, they were not a factor as AC Milan just ran away with the group. Predictably, Hans Westerhoff would be sacked at the end of the season. In retrospect, was this the reference season of PSV's lean years of the mid 90s?
You could say that it turned out that the team was not balanced at all. There were too many older, experienced players who were not, like I said, performing at their own old level anymore. And groups started to form within the squad. The young players, and you mentioned a lot of those young players already, they were left out of the team really. They were not really part of it. And during the season, there was a lot of discord within the team. There were too many jaded, recalcitrant, frustrated players. Romario's behavior was not longer tolerated either. And as a result, his own performance declined significantly too. Although the team did qualify for the Champions League group phase after this two leg battle against AEK Athens, the first leg was marked by a huge quarrel between Westerhoff and Romario, who was benched for like tactical reasons. So and in the return match, Romario took his revenge by scoring a hat trick in a 3-0 victory. But then he had already implied that he wanted to leave the club at all cost at the end of the season. And yeah, like you said, the Champions League group phase only earned what by 1 point. was not a reason to cheer about. For a long time, I remember this was even a negative Champions League record, 1 out of 6. But many people many players wanted to leave the team. And Westorff was sacked, but then he was kind of promoted to head of the youth academy. But he soon left the club too because he went back to Groningen. But yeah, I remember the atmosphere was at the lowest level at the end of that season when Feyenoord gained the title.
In addition, this era is the beginning of Feyenoord's rebirth after some lean years of themselves, almost a decade. It's also the beginning stages of the rise of Van Gaal's Ajax. Was this a reality self-evident that PSV could no longer just waltz with the title?
Well, Feyenoord had been working on building a solid team for some time after a few very difficult years in the late 1980s and early 1990s. And after surprisingly winning the National Cup in 1991 in a disastrous season, I think they finished 11th or something, they finally began to rise. And the following year, after eliminating Tottenham Hotspur, among others, under coach Wim Jansen, they even reached the semi-finals of the European Cup Winners' Cup, where they were eliminated by Arsene Wenger's and George Weah's AS Monaco. So it was only a matter of time before they returned to the top also domestically. And this happened in 1993, and when Feyenoord became national champions at the expense of PSV with Van Hanegem as coach. But a lot of Feyenoord fans still talk about that team. It was a solid, tough team with John de Wolf, Henk Vreese, players like that. Joseph Kieprits.
Oh, yes.
And at Ajax, on the other hand, a young Louis van Gaal was suddenly given the opportunity to become head coach during the 91-92 season after Leo Beenhakker suddenly accepted an offer from Real Madrid. And I remember the board was not happy about that at that time. And there was a lot of skepticism about him at first too, until Ajax won the UEFA Cup in the spring of 92 in a double final match against
Torino.
exactly. But it was only then that Van Gaal started to build his new team. They became national champion in 1994, and eventually they won the Champions League in 95, and the rest is history. And for PSV, it was always a thorn in their side that although successful nationally, the club was not as successful in Europe compared with Ajax and Feyenoord. And Ajax and Feyenoord also had bigger names internationally too. And well, somehow they still have, I think.
Was there further worry as Romario was sold to Barcelona in the summer of 1993, or was there belief he had gone as far as he could in the Eredivisie?
For Mario, the time had simply come to leave the club, and he had been with PSV for 5 years, and nowadays that would be unthinkable. But he was ready for something new, and in addition, he had his share of international dispute with players, with the coach and the board. And in such cases, it's better to part ways. And when Johan Cruyff wanted him at Barcelona, it wasn't that complicated anymore. However, in Barcelona, they also faced his whims and his behavior. And you have to think that he only stayed there for 1.5 years before going back to Brazil, which is not a very long time. But in the end, Romario was undeniably important to PSV, not least because of the prestige he brought, despite the lack of international success. And today, PSV is still very proud that a big player like Romario played for the club. And last week, a new book about him was even published, Romario in Eindhoven, written by journalist Frans van der Nieuwenhof. But that's maybe an idea for a separate podcast.
It's not only Romario. Gerald Vandenberg left that summer after so many years. For the 1993-94 season, you have the former Ajax, Mechelen, Anderlecht manager Ad de Mos appointed to pick up the pieces. As far as the transfer activity, I mentioned Gerald Vandenberg joins the new J League. He joins Jubilo Ivata. Dick Schroeder joins Sparta. We mentioned Romario joins Barcelona. Others like Raymond Behrens also departed. As far as the arrivals, you have Tom Van Mol returning from loan from Sparta. You have Edwin Van Ankeren arriving from Molenbeek. You have future Liverpool striker Eric Meyer joining from MVV. You have the Ghanaian teenager Nai Lamptey arriving from Anderlecht. Also, the late sweet midfielder Klaas Ingeson arrived from Mechelen.
Yeah,
Uh,
who later deceased, unfortunately.
Yes, on for
Yeah.
yeah. And in the new year, you would have Jan Wouters coming over from Bayern Munich, the former Ajax midfielder. But this would be an even more disappointing season for PSV as they finished third behind Louis van Gaal's Ajax and Feyenoord. They were disappointing in Europe in the UEFA Cup. They were eliminated in the first round to German side Karlsruhe. So all in all, a very disappointing season for PSV. In fact, this was the first time they'd finished third in a decade. This reflected their slide at this point.
Yeah. Well, when Arte Moss came, people were very positive because he had a lot of success with Ajax, with Mechelen and Anderlecht. So it was very logical for PSV to appoint him. But he came in Eindhoven with the famous words to the media, "I'm a guarantee for success." And unfortunately, those words, yeah, never came true. You mentioned all the transfers that came in, but the team was not very balanced too, and there were still a lot of old players who were still there, like Hans van Breukelen, Wim Kieft, and all. So in sporting terms, the season was very difficult, and apart from a resounding 4-1 victory at home against the eventual champions Ajax, there was very little to cheer about. The team very much struggled to score goals. Niji Lemty was actually quite a disappointment, let's say. And the eventual third place in the Eredivisie led to further changes to the squad in the summer of '94. So they had to rebuild the squad all over again at that time. Yes.
In the summer, you have Wim Kieft and Hans van Breukelen retiring. How instrumental were these two in PSV's glory years?
Well, Van Breukelen, he arrived from Nottingham Forest in 1984 and he played for PSV for 10 seasons. But he was almost 38 years old when he retired. And although he had been of a great value to PSV, he had started to show signs of wear and tear in recent years. But he also admitted that as much himself, although there had been a lot of discussion about him in the Netherlands, mostly in relation to the national team. He was always uncontroversial at PSV. But as a former teacher, Van Breukelen was somewhat of an outcast in this football world. But he will always be remembered as the man who saved the decisive penalty in the 1988 European Cup final against Benfica. But he was also the man who clumsily gave away a free kick against Feyenoord in 1987, resulting in an unnecessary draw known as the Tussock incidents, to put it in English, because he picked up the ball twice, which was not allowed. And he was very much joked about that moment. And that moment is still probably on YouTube. And for Wim Kieft, well, he arrived in 1987, stayed there for 3 seasons. Then he had a quarrel with former manager Guus Hiddink and was replaced by John Bosman for 1 season. But then he came back to PSV in 91, stayed there for 3 more seasons too. But his second spell was not as successful as his first spell. Later on, he would have private problems too. He would be have a drug addict problem and all. But Wim Kieft, nowadays he's very much on television a lot of times. Things are going well with him, fortunately, as I assume.
In the summer of 1994, PSV signed a certain 18-year-old Brazilian named Ronaldo. He was a couple of years away from becoming Il Fenomeno. Nevertheless, was there excitement about him or was he an unknown quantity at this point?
Without playing, Ronaldo was part of Brazil's World Cup squad that won the 1994 World Cup in the United States. But he was 17. And PSV snatched him away from Ajax, partly because Romario put in a good word for him. But this also allowed Patrick Kluivert to mature at Ajax, by the way. But because he was relatively unknown, there was more enthusiasm for the purchase of Belgian striker Luc Nilis from Anderlecht, who had already proven his worth at international level. But any possible skepticism about Ronaldo quickly disappeared, however, after the first league match against Vitesse, in which he scored 2 goals. And soon after that, he made himself a big name in Europe in the first round of the UEFA Cup at Bayer Leverkusen when he scored 3 goals in a 5-4 loss. And the 5-4 loss tells a lot about this season too, conceding many goals but also scoring many goals. But in his first season in the Eredivisie, Ronaldo scored 30 goals, and he was only 18 years old. So yeah, it was massive. I remember that.
That summer of 94, there's a massive clear out at PSV. So we already mentioned Kieft and Van Breukelen retired. You also have Adrie van Tegelen joining Dordrecht. Others like Edwin van Ankeren, Nai Lamptey, he joined Aston Villa. Erwin Koeman returned to Groningen. Klaas Ingeson joined Sheffield Wednesday. Jan Heinz leaves and joins Uerdingen in Germany. Yul Ellerman joins Twente. Others like Wim Duran, backup goalkeeper, he joins Camber. Jared Young leaves PSV, joins the French league at Caen. Kalusha joins the Mexican league, Club
Mhm.
America. After a month or so into the season, George Popescu joins Tottenham in England. Mitchell Vandergag joins the Scottish League at Motherwell. So there's a lot of departures. As far as the arrivals, of course, it's all about Ronaldo, who came from Cruzeiro. Others who joined the team included goalkeeper Ronald Waterreus of Roda JC. Former Ajax midfielder Marciano Vink arrived after one season in Italy with Genoa. The Brazilian Vampeta arrived from Vitoria. Budavin Paplatz arrived from Twente. Luc Nilis, Anderlecht striker, the Belgian striker, arrived to be, as Ronaldo put it, his favorite partner up front.
I
Uh,
still love that.
yeah. Former Ajax goalkeeper Stanley Menzo, who was a backup now because Edwin van der Sar was a starter, he joins PSV. Faber returned from Groningen. And a few months into the season, Stan Valks also returns to
Mhm.
PSV from Sporting Club Portugal. Ademos is unable to stop the slide, facing a rampant Ajax side that would win not only the league title but the Champions League. Not only that, but also there's Roda have one of their best seasons ever as they finish runner up. Demos is sacked in the mid-season and he's replaced by the then Dutch national team manager Dick Advocat, who actually improves the team. But at that point, Ajax were far ahead. Was there a feeling that PSV perhaps could get back to their previous form after what they showed in the second half of the season?
Like you mentioned, there was like a big cleanup. And the start of the season was actually quite promising. I think they won the first 3 league matches in a row. But then things quickly went downhill, and Artemos was sacked after 2 very painful
Yeah. The
defeats.
home
And
loss against Ajax at 4-1. I think
exactly
that
that,
was what really changed the
yeah,
trajectory. Yeah.
that was the homeless, the hopeless, the hopeless loss against Ajax, 4-1 at home. And I remember before the match, Boudewijn Zender was supposed to be in the starting lineup. But suddenly, just 5 minutes before the game, Erik Meyer showed up in the starting line in an unusual position for him as a left winger. And afterwards, the Moss said, I wanted to surprise Ajax. Well, after 15 minutes, it was already 3-0 down. And in midweek, PSV lost 2-1 at Willem II with many young players in the team, including a 16-year-old Wilfred Bauma, who was making his debut. But that was the last straw for the board. But before Dick Advocaat was appointed as a manager, like you said, club legend Kees Rijvers took over as an interim manager for a couple of matches. But he also got on very well with Ronaldo. And Advocaat's arrival in the winter, things improved, and a narrow 1-0 defeat away to an unbeatable Ajax gave the supporters some hope again. But what's more, they swept the floor with this legendary Roda JC team that was in great form that season, and the PSV won with 5-0 at home. And eventually, they still finished third that season with many goals scored, but also too many conceded.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and again in Europe, you mentioned earlier they would be eliminated in the first round to Bayer Leverkusen. And like you said, the first match was a 5-4 loss, and the second match was a scoreless tie.
Yeah.
It was, again, one
And it
round.
was over. Yes.
Do you think at the most joined the team at the worst time possible, or was he partially responsible for the poor results?
Well, the thing about Artem Moses, the funny thing is, after his dismissal, he continued to live in Eindhoven, and still he occasionally shares his view on PSV with the local newspaper every week, which is very much appreciated actually. But there was never really a match between De Mos and PSV. And in his first season, he had to clear up the mess from the past and rebuild the team. But he was also given the opportunity to do so in the summer of 94. However, the big mistake he made was that he started building the team from the front and not, as usual, from the back. De Mos brought in two super strikers, Niels and Ronaldo, but at the back had mostly only young players at his disposal, like Van der Gaag, Faber, Fuchs, Bromayon, etc. So there was a lot of disbalance in that team. And De Mos later admitted that he was wrong about that. And Advocaat would prove to do that a lot better later on.
We come to the 1995-96 season. You have Barry Van Aarle leaving the club after so many years, joining Helmand Sport. Others like Gregory Playfair, Patrick Pa, Eric Meyer leaves, joins Uerdingen in Germany. Robert Fuchs and Jürgen Dirks also leave. Later in the season, Peter Hoekstra joins Ajax, which was a rare move because usually the traffic is from one side to the other. But this is a rare Ajax signing a PSV player. Also,
Yeah,
Edward
that was
Lind
because Bodo and Zenden came up, and there was like a competition between the two of them.
Edward Linskens also one of the surprises of the 1988 triumph. He also in the second half of the season he joins NAC Breda. As far as the arrivals, you have the defender Chris van der Weerden arriving from Vitesse. Former Ajax midfielder Wim Jonk arrived from Inter in Italy after two disappointing seasons in the Serie A. Icelandic striker Eidur Gudjonsson arrived from Valur Reykjavik. Philip Koku arrived from Vitesse. Rene Eichelkamp arrived from Club Brugge in Belgium.
Mhm.
In the second half of the season, you have Jaap Stam, defender from Willem II, future Manchester United star and AC Milan, Lazio. There is slight improvement, though. Again, Ajax win the title as they still have the upper hand and reach the Champions League final as well. PSV did reasonably well that season. They also do better than expected in Europe. They eliminate Leeds United and Werder Bremen. In fact, Werder Bremen have had the most, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah,
Yes, true.
yeah. Before being eliminated in the quarterfinals by Johan Cruyff's Barcelona. They do win the Dutch Cup, so they do win a trophy that season, their first trophy since 1992. Was there a feeling that PSV were getting back to where they wanted to be?
Yes, you can say that definitely. Because although the championship was still out of reach because Ajax was still very strong, and they lost the Champions League final against Juventus after penalties in that season. But it remarked the recovery of the club again, with finally winning a trophy after 4 seasons without one, which is quite unusual for PSV. And in terms of play, and maybe that was even more important, this was perhaps one of the most entertaining PSV fans in history, actually. But Ronaldo was very much injured during the season, and in the cup final, he was not in the starting 11, and he was very upset about that and very angry. And he also said that that's the main reason why I wanted to leave the club after my second season there. I'm not sure about that. If I think in other cases he would also have joined Barcelona probably. But yeah, that was a good season, and they undeservedly and unnecessarily lost against Barcelona. I was at the home match in Barcelona, the 2-2 draw, when Niles scored two superb goals. But at home, many players were injured or suspended, so they had to play with a lot of young players. And a mistake was made. I remember Rene Klomp when Sergi scored a decisive winner, and PSV was eliminated out of the UEFA Cup. And we were all very disappointed about that, I remember. But yeah, the season was, well, let's say it was very prospective, to have the next season and to win something more, like the championship, which they would eventually do in '97, of course.
Yes, and PSV would break the 5-year titleless spell by winning the Eredivisie in 1997 with Dick Advocaat in charge. Now, for that season, you have players like Tommy De Ligt leaving and joining RKC. Of course, Ronaldo joined Barcelona. Others like Rene Klomp joined Lommel in Belgium. Later in the season, Budevin Paplatz would join Heerenveen. And we should mention this is the very first season of the new Bosman ruling. So you have Jan Willem van Ed coming from Utrecht as backup goalkeeper. You have the Yugoslav midfielder Zelko Petrovic arrived from RKC. Belgian forward Mark de Grijs arrived from Sheffield Wednesday. You have Danish midfielder Anders Nilsson. Later, you have the likes of Romanian midfielder Ovidiu Stinga, another Danish player Niklas Jensen. But a significant signing would be in the second half of the season would be the temperamental Belgian striker Gilles de Bielde, who arrived from Anderlecht, followed by the Danish forward Dennis Romendal from Lyngby. PSV would win the league title in a season where Van Gaal's Ajax team had reached its limit, and I think they finished fourth that season.
Yes, the '96 '97 season, they got off to a promising start with a clear 3-0 victory in the Dutch Super Cup match against Ajax. I remember, in a brand new Amsterdam
Oh
arena.
yes, that was
Uh,
the inauguration season of Amsterdam
yes,
Arena. Yes.
exactly. With a fantastic goal by Eikelkamp, I remember. This was the prelude to the national title that would later be won, like you said. Like you also said, Ajax had clearly declined after many players had left the club, and the club had become somewhat filled up to its success. But it's true, during the season, the arrival of Belgian striker Gilles de Bilde, who was suspended after an incident he had against Eendracht Aalst, I remember. He hit someone or something, I don't
Right,
remember
right.
exactly.
Right.
But that was the opportunity for PSV to get him off the PSV. And also the arrival of Mark de Grijs, he was not in his greatest form when he was at PSV. However, he was still very important. Yeah, that's why they won the league after a 3-1 win against Willem II. But in Europe, there was another disappointment because in the first round of the European Cup Winners' Cup, PSV were knocked out again, and this time by Norwegian side Brandbergen with Tore André Flo up front. So still disappointment in Europe was the case.
The 1997-98 season will be the last season under Dick Advocaat. As far as the players leaving, you have the likes of Eichelkamp, he joined Schalke. Zelchko Petrovic joins the Japanese league Urawa Red Diamonds. Later in the season, Niklas Jensen goes back to the Danish league to FC Copenhagen. Now, as far as the rivals, you have the Polish midfielder Tomasz Iwan arriving from Feyenoord, the Slovakian midfielder Igor Demo arrived from Slovan Bratislava, Arnold Brugink arrived from Twente. You have the Danish striker Peter Moller arriving from Brøndby. Later in the season, you have Russian midfielder Dmitry Kolkov from Torpedo, Lithuanian defender Andrius Skerla from Zalgiris. Defender Andre Uyer arrives from Roda JC. So this season, Ajax would run away with the league title, winning 29 matches, scoring 112 goals with goal difference of 90. That was the season with Michael Laudrup. I believe his one and only season with Ajax. But also, more importantly, PSV also lose in the Dutch Cup final against Ajax 5-0. So Ajax win the double. In the Champions League, also PSV does not do too well. They're in a group with Barcelona, Dynamo Kiev, and Newcastle.
Newcastle, yes.
Yeah, and they win both their matches against Newcastle, but otherwise they lose against Dynamo Kiev, and all their other matches end up as ties. They're eliminated from the group. Was there a feeling that Advocat had stabilized the club after a number of difficult seasons?
Well, yes, as known, the Bosman ruling at the time had a major impact on football in general and Dutch clubs in particular. So key players from the team that won the league title the year before, they wanted to take advantage of their transfer-free status. This meant that they did not want to sign a new contract. So during the season, you could sense that an exodus was imminent. And this was also reflected by the team's performance. You mentioned Champions League. I remember they were trashed by Dynamo Kiev with a fantastic Sergei Rebrov and then Shevchenko up front. But even Advocaat himself, he succumbed to a lucrative offer from Glasgow Rangers. But he had done a good job at PSV, but the lemon had been, let's say, squeezed dry. And after the season, Cocu, Stam, Newman, Young, and Zenden, all key players, left the club. And the new team had to be built again from scratch. But yeah, the loss of the title and the 5-0 loss in the cup final was very painful. I remember the day after the Dutch Cup final, they all announced their departures. All of a sudden, yeah.
For the 1998-99 season, Bobby Robson would return to manage the club, but this time in a different context. This time, as far as the players leaving, you have Budavin Zenden joining Barcelona, backup goalkeeper Willem van Ede joining Haarlem, Jaap Stam joined Manchester United, Arthur Newman joined Rangers, Peter Moller joined Real Oviedo in Spain, Wim Jonk joined Sheffield Wednesday, Mark de Grijs joined Ghent in Belgium, Philip Coco also joined Barcelona. Later in the season, you have the Russian Sergei Temryukov joining Dinamo Moscow. Brazilian defender Marcus joins Sporting Club Portugal. As far as the arrivals, you have a certain Ruud van Nistelrooy arriving from Heerenveen. Bjorn van der Dolen arrived from Standard Liège. Davy Oyen joined from Genk, a Belgian defender. A Russian
Yuri
defender,
Nikiforov.
yeah,
Yeah.
Yuri Nikiforov joined from Sporting Gijón. Marcos, the defender, Brazilian defender, joined from Rio Ave before he returned to Sporting. Theo Lucius arrived from Den Bosch. Former goalkeeper Patrick Lodovics also returned from Groningen. Also, you have the Finnish striker Jonas Kolka arriving from Willem II. Portuguese defender Abel Xavier arrived from Oviedo. Georgian midfielder Georgi Gakokidze. And later in the season, you have Jurgen Dirks returning from Fortuna Sittard. This season, PSV would finish third behind Feyenoord, who won their second title in the decade, and also a surprising Willem II side. In Europe, they're in the Champions League, but they're in a group with Benfica and AJK Helsinki and Kaiserslautern. And again, they don't move beyond this stage. But getting back to Bobby Robson, despite the third place finish, was he received better this time around?
Well, from the beginning, it was known that Bobby Robson was intended to serve as an interim manager for 1 year, as Erik Gerrits was still under contract with Club Brugge. PSV desperately wanted Erik Gerrits to be the coach. And Robson himself, he dreamed of returning to his beloved Newcastle United as a manager, but at that time, Ruud Gullit was still there. So Robson knew from the beginning he had an almost impossible task that season because the team had been completely sold off. So with the new players who arrived, the players you mentioned, it resembled a foreign legend, legend. But Ruud van Nistelrooy, he was at that time the most expensive purchase ever at that time. And in the end, Robson managed to make something of the team during the season and miraculously finished third after a remarkable comeback match in Utrecht. I remember they were 2-0 down after 17 minutes or something, and they still won 3-2, which still earned them a place in the Champions League. And after that match, there was this famous anecdote that the phone rang in the dressing room, and Robson said suddenly, "Shh." quiet. It's the Pope calling to congratulate us. But there has always been a lot of admiration for Bobby Robson, and he was very much valued by PSV. He still is. So I think everybody was quite happy when he decided to come for one season. Yes.
So now we come to the end of the decade. For the 1999-2000 season, the former captain, the Belgian Eric Gerrits, is appointed as manager. As far as departures, you have the likes of Marciano Vink, Davy Oyen, Theo Lucius, Georgi Gakokidze, Igor Demo, Gilles de Bild. They all leave the club. As far as arrivals, you have the Swiss midfielder Johann Vogel from Grasshoppers. You have Mark van Bommel arriving from Fortuna Sittard. The Yugoslav goalkeeper Ivica Kralj from Porto. Jan Heinz returns to the club from Bayer
Hmm.
Leverkusen. Wilfred Boma returning from loan. I believe he was on loan to Fortuna Sittard.
Fortuna Sittard, yes.
You have the Ghanaian defender Eric Ado from Club Brugge. Later in the season, you have Brazilians like Kleberson and Claudio arriving. Eric Gerrits would lead the club to league titles in 2000 and 2001. They ended the decade and started this new millennium in a positive fashion. And I imagine they were where they wanted to be, despite still not advancing in the Champions League, being eliminated in a group containing Bayern Munich, Valencia, and Rangers Glasgow.
Hmm. Yeah, that was not successful again. But Erik Heers, he arrived at the perfect moment. He was very popular at that time, and he was also named PSV Player of the 20th Century. At that moment, the club was quite stable, and there was some room for reinforcement. Now it had reached the Champions League with the star duo of Niels and Van Nistelrooy. Well, Van Nistelrooy later got a very bad knee injury just before Alex Ferguson wanted to sign him. And later on, Matea Kesman, he came from Partizan Belgrado, I believe. But all that was enough to win two league titles in a row, and PSV were very dominant. However, yeah, like you said, the Champions League campaigns were not particularly successful either. Although there was this very famous 3-1 victory over world-class Manchester United at home. But then again, it was not enough to advance in Europe, unfortunately.
So, as the decade ended, PSV did not reach the standards of the 1988 triumph in the Champions Cup. Was Europe an afterthought as domestic success had been out of reach for many years?
Well, I wouldn't say that, but it became an obsession that the group stage of the Champions League was never survived. But at that time, you could still end up in the UEFA Cup tournament after the Champions League. But that was not a success either. And I remember a match against Kaiserslautern at home in March 2001, and that it's quite famous because the crowd they threatened to storm the pitch after being provoked by German player Mario Basler following a penalty kick. And Erik Heres personally, he ensured that the crowd returned to the stands. He was like standing in front of them and saying, pointing them, go back, go back. But as a punishment, PSV had to play a European home match 100 kilometers from Eindhoven in the next season, as ordered by the UEFA. And I remember they played that match in Arnhem against Galatasaray in a 3-1 victory in the next season. But yeah, like you said, it has become an obsession. It would take a long time before that obsession was deleted, let's say.
In general, how would you rate the club's transfer policy during this decade?
In general, during this period, the club's policy was shaped partly as a result of the Bosman ruling, of course, to recruit young, talented players and to sell them on to foreign, well, let's say, powerhouses for large sums of money. But after they had been successful at PSV, and not every signing is successful, it does not always work, but in general, the club has been very successful in this regard, especially during this decade. But they still do the same thing, actually. But yeah, circumstances have changed, of course, since then.
Looking back, what were the reasons for the club's troubles in the middle of the decade? Was it poor management selections or coincidence that Van Gaal's Ajax were at their peak then?
That's a difficult question. It's hard to say. Ultimately, dominance in Dutch club football is always a matter of ups and downs. And that was the case then. And you see it's still happening right now. Successful periods are interspersed with less successful ones. Who would have thought that Ajax would have fallen so far after their recent glory years? They were once called the Bayern Munich of the Netherlands, and they are very much in depression right now, but ultimately they will rise again. And the same happened for PSV. Although I must say that PSV domestic minimum level has never been extremely low in all those decades. And the years we are discussing now in this podcast, they were very turbulent in terms of management too. If there's a restless management, a restless board, you always see that back on the pitch, I think. So it works both ways. At the one hand, Feyenoord and Ajax were doing a great job, but PSV had a lot of management problems too. Yes.
Comparing the beginning of the decade and the end of the decade, were PSV in a better place or a worse place?
I think definitely better, but I don't think there's a question about that. Although things went downhill again after more and more players left the club, and they lost faith in coach Eric Gerrits. And in the summer of 2002, there was no other choice to sack him because too many players were quarreling with him. And he also had some private problems, I remember. But it was Harry van Rij, who was the chairman at the time, once said it was on a sportive way, it was the most difficult decision I ever had to take to sack him. But to come back to your question, I really think that if you compare the beginning or the end of the decade, the end was definitely better, yes. And after that, they continued to be successful with Guus Hiddink as a coach, as a successor of Erik Gerrits.
As we reach the end of the decade, what was the outlook for the post millennium era in this post Bosman era?
Mm-hmm. Ultimately, PSV didn't fare too badly, I think. What you did start to see, however, is that squads they don't stay together for too long, and they are constantly being refreshed. So buying and selling players had become like the business model for clubs like PSV. In a way, that's a shame because players have less attachment to the club. On the other hand, well, it's simply the reality we have to deal with nowadays, I think.
In closing, how do PSV historians regard this decade of the club? What are the positives and negatives?
Well, on a positive note, I think the club finally started winning trophies again after several lean years, and the supporters were really ready for that. But on the negative side, yeah, the club failed to achieve the desired success in Europe for many years. It would take until 2005 before the club reached another semi-final in a European tournament, a feat that has unfortunately not been repeated since. Unlike Ajax, Feyenoord, and even AZ Alkmaar, who reached semi-finals in European competition. But to this day, this still remains a source of frustration for many PSV supporters, and it's only becoming more difficult nowadays to be successful in Europe. Yeah, with the current state of affairs in international football, I think. Yeah,
1988 was always going to be a tough act to follow.
exactly. Yes, we knew that. We knew that. Yeah.
Well, with that, I would like to thank you for your participation in this interview. All our respective contact information is listed on the blog and podcast uploads. So, Paul, thank you once again, and
Thank you.
hope to continue these discussions on football history.
Absolutely, we'll do that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.